for the second nap is right up here in the corner. So again, if you know your map well, we're right up there, further upstream, and I said greater Shoals area, so that I could include these right here. So we have Second Nap. That is on Second Creek. There's Elk River, so it's a little bit west of Elk River. And the county wanted to replace a bridge, and just like so often, I went under the bridge to do the survey, and I didn't want to drive back across the bridge after seeing what I was underneath, because some of these bridges really do need replacing. So anyway, I went and did all my hole digging and realized down in the gravel were all sorts of both, there's leftover waste flakes, there were preforms, there were cores, core being a rock from which other pieces of rock were struck to make a useful tool. And then all sorts of unmodified, really nice chert, both from the Tuscumbia Formation and from the Fort Payne chert. And what it is in that area, and you can see on the geologic map, is that you have the lighter kind of olive color and the darker olive color. The darker olive color being Fort Payne chert, lighter being Tuscumbia on top of it. Second Creek is a ravine that is cut down through the Tuscumbia into the Fort Payne, and what is left behind is all this chert gravel. Brought literally tons and tons of it, traveling with each flood. You know, another shoal moves a little bit further south, and all along the banks of this creek where the bridge was crossing, because that's where I had permission to go, were where people had gathered rocks out of the river or out of the creek, taken them up on the bank and smashed them in all sorts of pieces to make them into tools. A little bit further up was outcrop of Fort Payne chert. Right along that, I could find some lumps of actual Fort Payne chert that did not have the cortex. And I brought a couple of rocks, still with dirt on them, but you can look at them afterwards. And these are two pieces of Fort Payne chert. And really the difference between them is this one has rounded edges. This one was carried in a stream, tumbled in a stream, and it's got those rounded edges. This lump right here came straight off the slope. And this is a piece of angular rock that is the same kind of rock. So the people had choice of getting it straight coming out of the rock face or in a stream. And so often, and I'm beginning to conclude that so often, really they weren't bringing this rock straight out of the rock face, or getting it out of the gravels. And the way you can tell is looking for the leftover debris from making the tools, and you will see that it has some of that brown cortex, if you're lucky enough. Okay, so Second Nap site. There's my little drawing of Second Nap. So you have rocks coming out of the Tuscumbia and rocks coming out of the Fort Payne, concentrated by millions of years of water action. All right, the next site. Now, some of y'all recognize this illustration from the old, yeah, there you go. So if you look all the way to your left, you'll see Mulberry Creek. That's the Mulberry Creek Mound. So it's a little bit downstream of where we are, right about at the lower edge of what we would call the Shoals. And this thing is now, it's a little island, even though the river has been, the river level has been raised substantially. It was excavated in the late 1930s with WPA labor for eventually the building of Pickwick Lake. They only dug a small portion of this site, which is really a shame. Let's see, I thought I had a picture of, I was in too much of a hurry making these slides. Anyway, so what we have is an accumulation of a lot of shell, a lot of midden debris, but here's the really cool part, and this is why this slide makes it into this talk. You can see right here this dark layer, and I don't know if you can read it or not, but it says flint. And so we're looking at, and here's a foot, we're looking at a 1 to 2 feet thick layer.
That answered my question.
Yeah.
Is it bedrock? If so, is bedrock?
No, what it is this is built on a, and I did myself wrong by not including this slide, or at least this version. Yeah, I don't have it. Anyway, if you know the Pickwick Lake well enough, it's where Mulberry Creek flows into the river. It's a little bit upstream from Coger's Island. It is in that cross section that I was talking about. Let's see if I give you a cross section. Yes, here it is. Drew another cross section. Here's where it's going through Mulberry Creek. So you have the river bottom, and it's Pleistocene and later alluvium. That's all just sand and gravel. It, again, like I said, the river dug down until it hit the Fort Payne Chert, and it's really hard to make it through, so it just fans out and rumbles across it. But it has already cut through the Tuscumbia Formation, which is pretty easily done. Mulberry Creek comes in, and the Mulberry Creek Mound would be right there on that alluvium. So it is built on top of sand, silt, and gravel that was deposited sometime in the Pleistocene. There's some...
So I'm
Yeah.
lost. Was it flint shards or is it?
Oh yeah, that is all debris, and it's
Debris, okay.
yeah. If you go and read the report, it's kind of amazing because this is a huge area. Let's see. You can see. Let's see. This one is probably that's about 100 feet from here to here. This is like 30 feet of accumulated debris. And within that is this zone where they did nothing but break up flint.
So in the 70s, that's what I was walking on, is that zone. It's about
If you're in the 70s walking on that, you would have only been right up in, that's the only part that's above water.
yeah, but
When they dropped it down, you could see the,
we used to look in the water like that.
yeah, well, you would be going on some of these areas. This is way underwater. And of course, you know, what you know from there, and I got to go out there a couple of times myself, and a boat goes by, and the waves come in, and you hear all the clinking of large flakes of flint just banging against each other. It's just really something else. And that's not even the layer that's solid flint. So anyway, the interesting thing is they did dig this stratigraphically. They didn't dig all these sites stratigraphically. They were just figuring out archaeology at the time, in my opinion. But the neat thing is they graphed it, and the period of time that this zone of flint, you can see the little, see in this bar graph, a couple of the types of flint poke way on out. Those are these preforms. And so they did these complete preforms and then broken ones, and lots of the broken ones. And so what was happening, and the reason why you would find a lot of broken ones and not as many of the whole ones, doesn't take a whole lot of time to think about this, to figure it out, is that they were making these things, and if they were successful, they probably carried them somewhere else. And if you look at any archaeological site within 300 miles of here, it seems, especially if you go south and east, you'll find these large stem points made out of blue-gray Fort Payne chert. And they stick out like a sore thumb when you're out down there in the coastal plain, because you know this rock didn't come from around there. The rock came from up here. And it probably traveled in the form of these preforms, later to be made into, you know, Mulberry Creek, Mulberry Creek, you know, Savannah River stem type points, you know, the large stem points. Well, and again, this zone right here with the big, where the bar pokes out, that's where all these preforms were found. So the way I interpret this is that sometime around 5,000 years ago, these people set up at the mouth of Mulberry Creek and were pulling this lumps of chert out of the river channel, probably at low water time. They wouldn't be going out there this time of year. They would be waiting for it and be nice and dry, pull all these lumps of chert out there and doing nothing but making preforms. So we've got a pretty significant event. And then, of course, those things were scattered out across the area. So we're looking at actually, you know, flint manufacture on an industrial level to make a commodity, not necessarily make a tool that you know that you're going to need to skin a deer or something like that. No, they're going to make these commodities so that somebody else will skin the deer, and they just have to give them some flint for it, you see. So there was, and in fact, in this period of time and a little bit later, you find all sorts of blue-gray Fort Payne chert and Tuscumbia chert all the way out there in Louisiana over there at the Poverty Point site. There's
Just the Native Americans would trade or sell, or wouldn't trade?
Yes, yeah, and so again, this was they didn't have money for the medium of exchange, but they sure did have standardized preforms. And there are periods of time where the preforms do change, but these long, skinny ones are most likely late archaic preforms. And you can, by looking at the broken ones, you can see where they were going with most of these as well. They split out into different types, whether it had a flat bottom or round bottom. That may be significant, but really the important thing is the length to width. And you see a lot of these things that are, and this is the very early stage in a preform right here where it's pretty wide. This may be slightly older than some of these late archaic ones. Anyhow, that's Mulberry Creek Mound. All right, here's where I had great luck over a period of a few years of getting to do some cultural resource management archaeology right in a place that I would have chosen to do. This is let's see, it's Wilson Lake right here is the body of water. We're in Colbert County, right on the edge. In fact, that rock bridge is just over there near that one CT 608 site. These are all scatters of mostly of chipstone debris. We found a number of projectile points on it, and again, we found everything from early archaic points all the way up to small little triangular arrow points. But right in here, found a little village site that I later was able to I had one radiocarbon date in my budget. And so I got my one radiocarbon date, and I didn't really have a great, there was no slam dunk thing to do. So I got this deer tooth, and over at Beta Analytic, they told me, it's like, when you do teeth, it always comes out a couple hundred years older than you really think it is. And I was like, well, it's the only thing I've got, and sure enough, it came out about 1300, but I think I was looking at some stuff in the 1500s. But anyway, so there was a village there. But the neat thing is it was one of these places that was, it's a great flat piece of ground, well above the river, and again, I've mapped these two layers of rock that I keep talking about. This is the Tuscumbia Formation, and this is the Fort Payne Chert. And the river's really wide right in there because it has hit the Fort Payne Chert and is partially cut through it. And even though we're a good bit upstream from right here at Muscle Shoals, where you only see the Tuscumbia limestone in that bluff, the Fort Payne Chert is right under the surface of the water. There's a little bit of it's not a fold, but it's bent upward. So we get lower rocks up here. And so these folks had the choice of both Fort Payne Chert and Tuscumbia Chert on that one spot. So anyway, I got to do an excavation out there, and sure enough, we found a skeleton, we found houses and all that, and so this area was to be avoided rather than dug any further, which was a little bit of disappointment for me, because every scoop of dirt that was coming out of the ground and hitting the shaker screen, it's like, this is the one with the Cumberland point in it. This is the one with the Cumberland point. Cumberland point never showed up. We dug a whole lot of holes, so here's all our holes, and this is a LiDAR, early LiDAR image. They've gotten so much better. So this would be a deep ravine. This would be a relatively flat spot. It's where the village was, and the general slopes. And we dug a lot of holes all around there trying to figure out where people were and weren't. Well, they were all over that hill.
Mr. Meredith, how long ago was that dig done?
I did that one in, gosh, it's 9 years ago. So anyway, and the first time I went through, and it was winter, and it was nice, outside, and very, very comfortable. And then we did a test, and it was in the fall, and it was very nice out there. Well, we did most of the work in the dead of summer, and let me tell you, that place was so covered in ticks. It was hard to believe. And we didn't get any deer ticks. It was all the dog ticks. Great big old things. It was awful. So we all stayed in on the other side of the river over at the Wheeler State Park cabins. And so, and it was me and a crew of 6 women. All the women would get together and check out and pull ticks off of themselves. And of course, I wasn't invited because it would have been very Hollywood and inappropriate, and so I had to just, mind the ticks myself. So that was the Mossy Bluff site. So you say that to anybody who was working on my crew at the time, they'll go, "Oh, the ticks," But it was some great archaeology. And this is a quick summary. So we found stuff from 3 big intervals of time, and this is what started me on this little mapping over time, the way people approached these church resources. We didn't find the Cumberland Point, but did find a really nice prismatic blade with side scraper on it. Got an early archaic point that was used up to the point where everybody wanted to call it a drill, but this is essentially a lost lake variety, a corner notch point. The very base is broken off. It was resharpened all the way up to this really narrow tip. And so anyway, so we got a couple of really old things. And again, you can see that these people were being very conservative with the use of the chert that they had, in that they're sitting on, and this is a cross section of that hill. In fact, I think I drew a little line over there. Let's see, not that one. There. I drew this little line right here. This is where my cross section is. So if you took a great big old machete and chopped that hill in half, you would wind up with something that looks a little bit like this thing. And so you have Tuscumbia Formation on the top, Fort Payne Chert on the bottom. There's a mantle of soil over all of that. Within that mantle of soil are all these lumps of chert that come out of the limestone from these 2 formations. And so these people, even though they were sitting on top of a mountain of chert, were being very conservative with the rocks that they had. The prismatic blaze is a very efficient use of to get the maximum amount of blade edge to volume of chert. And so they were struck off in long, skinny blades. And these long, skinny blades would only be, say a 1/4 inch thick or so. Although some of them are a little bit longer. This is probably the first strike off of a core on a prismatic blade here. Anyhow, and they're also a pretty good marker for your earlier than Dalton horizon. So you're looking at, early to middle Paleo-Indian. So this is within this person's toolkit probably was like, some Cumberland points or Clovis points or something like that. This is being about a couple of thousand years younger, but they're still being very efficient with their chart. Then there was a middle of late archaic component, and we only found 1 broken point, but we found all these preforms. And guess what? They look just like the Mulberry Creek Mound preforms. They're relatively narrow as far as preforms go. Most of them that I found were broken. And so in the late archaic period, and again, we're talking about, roughly 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, maybe even a little bit older than that, people were making these preforms to carry somewhere else. That's why you make a preform, is essentially bring it down. This rock is going to work, and therefore you don't have any excess chert on there, but you also are not, well, it weighs a lot less. So you can put 100 in a sack, and carry it down to Monroe County if you wanted to. Or trade it with somebody who came up there. It depends on how much of a sheik you were, and I think these people were as close as you could be to rich in those days, and that they had this commodity that everybody needed and wanted. So anyway, they were making these preforms. really the most exciting thing that I found, though, and you know, I get asked this all the time when I'm talking to people who are, you know, curious about what it's like to be an archaeologist. You know, what's the most interesting thing you found? I think they're wanting to hear about the crystal skull or the gold idol or, you know, the lost Confederate gold or something like that. But really, my mind goes to things like this. So we're digging through all this stuff, and we got all this stuff in the lab. I started realizing that we had all these little preforms, and preform I use a lot. It's just simply not a completed artifact. And I noticed that we have these down on the bottom. You see the little small triangular points that we would call Mississippi triangular, or if you want to go Madison, Hamilton, whatever. And this is a good, anyway, that's a systematics thing. But those are the completed ones were like you find anywhere. But the preforms, the ones on top, I noticed that if there were any surfaces, and I think I do have a slide that zooms in a little bit on that. Yeah. If there are any surfaces like this one, they would be patinated. The little detached flakes around the edges were relatively limited patination. The patina is something that forms on the surface of stuff over time in the presence of acid. And so these preforms here are made on old flakes. So what had happened in the Tennessee Valley, and specifically on this spot, but I suspect if I found any other sites from around 1500, is there had been so much accumulated waste chert around that people didn't have to go down into these ravines and carry up big blocks of chert. They just simply looked around their hearth and plucked up some flakes of flint that somebody 4,000 years ago had just thrown away because they were so rock rich, you know, they were just throwing these things around. And these folks who needed to make a much smaller tool would take the waste that these archaic folks had done and reduced them down into their little arrow points that way. And I think that's just wonderful. And it's such a different approach to chert than, say, what they were doing at the Mulberry Creek Mound, where they were making this thing on a factory level and making a commodity. These people were making a thing to be used, you know, right down, you know, the next spot over where the deer was trying to eat their corn or something like that.
Steve, why do you think the early guys felt like they needed to be so efficient with these?
That's a good mystery, and that's something I don't know because they were in a rock-rich area, and the rocks from this area did travel out. And a whole other thing that I was talking about last time I was here is that they went in certain directions. They didn't go down on the coastal plain with their rocks from around here that I've found so far, but they sure did go further north and further west with this Fort Payne chert and Tuscumbia chert. And why they were so efficient, I don't know, but you know, that corner notch point had been whittled down to, it was this narrow little thing where it was actually thicker than it was wide near the point, you know, and that was from blade edge resharpening. And so they carried that thing with them, you know, who knows. And part of it probably had a lot to do with, and this is part of the thing that leads to the interpretation that these people really did move around a lot. And so if you had a tool, a component tool, which would have been like a handle, you know, the sharp edge, the stone, and everything that tied it together, then that thing would need to be light, you know, and they might be going into areas like, say, up on they would go beyond the second scarp, and once you're up on the Pottsville Formation, you aren't going to find a useful rock to make a sharp edge. So they carried those things perhaps up into the hills as well. We're using the thing, and it probably ended up at the Mossy Bluff site where they were retooling, and so they probably threw the thing away, where they had been using it for a long period of time and resharpening it over and over again. And also with a prismatic blade, that thing was, you know, again, a very useful thing, but it was also worn down a good bit too. And I had mentioned earlier on there the Heaven's Halfacre site, which I just never got around to in this slide. You can see, okay, so we have Mossy Bluff right there about in the middle. Heaven's Halfacre is about 4 miles south of Mossy Bluff. It is, as you can see, right dead center in the middle of the Tuscumbia Formation outcrop. It is a group of sites that are around a set of sinks. And sinks are where the limestone is dissolved into a cave, and the cave has collapsed. And so the oldest components on that site, again, were, 13,000 years ago. This is the Clovis components. And we know that in some ways the ground surface has not changed much, but in some ways it probably really has. And why that particular area right there? I mean, the Clovis and Cumberland Points have been found all up and down the river in that area, but nowhere like, the quantities that were found in that one area. And I have wondered, and I've got this is in the realm of, not even hypothesis, but speculation, is that were those folks at the Heavens Halfacre because they could go on the edges of the sinks and pluck out lumps of Tuscumbia chert. And so one thing that really needs to be done, and I know I've seen some of the artifacts, but not certainly a large enough sample to know for sure. Some of them are made out of Tuscumbia chert, some are made out of Blue Gray Fort Payne chert.
Mark Cole and myself and Charles Moore, we've hypothesized over the last 4 or 5 years that location allowed them to bound to the river to hunt.
Yeah.
It allowed them to bound the other places, and if you look
Yeah, Town Creek.
yeah. If you look at it where it's in between 3 or 4 major crossing sites.
Yep.
Where if you're living there, it's an easy 10, 12 mile push to go catch caribou or buffalo crossing.
Well, one thing that's really interesting, and I know for those of you who have actually reached down and picked the artifacts up, is that there is a pretty high percentage of manufacturing failures. Well, you will find a Clovis point where they got as far as fluting the thing, and if any of y'all have ever chipped stone, you know what kind of a risk you're taking when you take a long, narrow piece of stone, strike on one end long ways. So often the fracture will travel and then scoop across, break it into 2 pieces and sometimes 3, and then you throw it on the ground. And a number of those things that y'all found were actually manufacturing failures rather than completed artifacts. That again makes me think, well, gosh, were these people actually gathering the stone right there at those sinks?
But granted, I've not considered
Could be.
this stone in the sinks.
Yeah, it really could be. Now, of course, the sinks also, back in the Pleistocene, were probably also full of water too. And so they would have been a great place to hunt geese and stuff like that. But anyway, so that's Heavens Halfacre. Let's see, and so I think I may be about towards the end of my slides. Yep, I am. So anyway, that is a real quick summary. So we start off efficient, the Paleo-Indian or early Archaic, perhaps gathering at sinkholes, but we really don't know. There are also, for instance, like at the Quad site, a little bit further up, all sorts of manufacturing failures. Again, you to make a Clovis point, and Stuart, you have one in your pocket right now where they got only so far. There's a couple of steps that these folks took that are very distinctive from later points, in that you can see where they were going even if they didn't get there, and several steps along the way, and each of those is kind of hazardous to bringing a point to conclusion, especially compared to, like, if you're going to make an ads like this, you really only need to get, it can be, actually it's better if it's really thick, but a lot of the Clovis points, and especially Cumberland points, are exceptionally thin. And so even if you didn't make it to a point, you can recognize where they're going. Yeah, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about the prismatic blades.
Yeah.
How can you tell, like, a prismatic blade from just this core strike that maybe
Right. Well, and I don't know if let me see. You might be able to see a little bit on here. The way you look, there'll be uniface. So there'll be one face that's pretty much flat. So you have your dorsal and your ventral side. The ventral side will be flat. The dorsal side will have scars from other detachments. And so what people were really shooting for in making a prismatic blade core is they would take a rock similar to this and most likely using a drift. So they didn't use direct percussion, but it was indirect percussion. So it was a multiple setup. And there's some great YouTube videos about, there's this one guy in Denmark who has a great amount of flint, and he also is pretty talented, and he'll hold a drift at the right spot on the core and then whack the drift with a hammer. It would have been a rock, usually not this big, although this one apparently was used as a hammerstone. But still, that would detach a long, narrow flake. This one would have been the one that we had out here. Yeah, this would have been the first strike. So you see on this one, you have a nice, really flat surface. On the back, and this is because this one's the first strike, once you get past the cutting all the outside edge, then the inside edge will all have the detachments from the previous round. And so you wind up with an object that, I'll draw one real fast, an object that is fairly distinctive. Once you found one, you know what you're looking at, but it'll be a long, narrow thing. This will be the outline of it, but on the backside, on the dorsal surface, you'll have these other detachments, these scars of flakes, and they'll all have been struck in the same direction. Yeah, so it is sort of like you're talking about on a fluted column. However, it won't be quite as uniform, but it can be. Some of these people were really skilled at what they did, and every now and then you can find these things, and when they were used up, a completely exhausted core will generally be kind of round, come up to a point. And it looks like it's almost one of those things that, in the Middle Ages they made for people to step on. This is a sharp, pointy thing with a flat surface on the bottom. And so that's how you tell it was a prismatic blade. It will have the scars on the backside. People continued to use flakes as tools, and especially in the early Archaic period. But you can tell an Archaic scraper from a Paleo scraper in that the Archaic scraper is mainly off of a not quite as formalized core. And so you'll have a flake tool, and it will have the flat surface. And so often they also use what's called the bulb of percussion. When you hammer one of these things, and there is a bulb of percussion on here, but it's not. You wind up with, on the flat side of the flake, there'll be a little bump right behind where you hit the thing. That is the great starting point for a scraper edge, and so often it's the bulb of percussion is the working end of it. The early Archaic people continued to make these cores, they just did not use blade cores. And so you'll find an early Archaic scraper will be uniface. It will have a steep edge, and it'll often be on the end, but it won't have, on the backside, it won't have those flake scars going in the same direction. And that is, it seems like a minor thing, but there's a whole lot of reasons to do it like that too. And there also is a skill level that, it has to be passed down from generation to generation. And eventually, by about 10,000 years ago, people didn't see the need for making these prismatic blades. And so people quit doing it. Now you see it, the whole technology come back up again in the Middle Woodland period. Around 2,000 years ago, people started making blades again from cores, but they were making them they were tiny, cute little things, but they will be prismatic blades as well. So you'll look on the dorsal side and there'll be detachments all going down the same direction. What these folks were doing with, somebody needs to figure that out. They were cutting something, but you get to a Middle Woodland period site here in the Tennessee Valley, and so often, if you know what you're looking for, you can find these little prismatic blades. They will be small though, and they're also, instead of another thing that I've noticed, It's another great thing. CRM dropped me down on this one neat site in Limestone County that was a middle woodland site. We found all these blades. I'm pretty sure they were making the cores using a direct hard hammer percussion. So you'd have a really big bulb of percussion instead of when you see these late Paleo-Indian or Paleo-Indian style prismatic blades, the bulb of percussion is not a big fat thing. It's relatively flat, and that indicates that they were probably using a soft hammer and indirect percussion. So there's been all sorts of really smart people have worked really hard on disentangling the stuff that we found in the ground, and one of them is on the prismatic blades. And mainly you have to look at European stone analysis to get all that. Americans, some of us are catching up. But anyway, that's, yeah, prismatic blades in 5 minutes. Yeah, you had a question?
One further, what do you think was the main reason paleo guys were fluting their points?
You know, my bet is, well, there's you have just about anything anybody does, you have both, functional use and then you have cultural use. And so did those people, when they were making a Cumberland point, really need to detach a flake, that's 3 inches long and goes almost all the way up to the point? No, they didn't need to do that. But, if they did it, everybody was like, you're all right, and so you get, esteem in your community, which means everything, and so.
Maybe they created a patent on it.
Yeah, right. And so there was a function, there was definitely a use to have a thin base to haft onto there. But then beyond that, there's all sorts of other things that, and you can see there are expedient clovis points, and then there are high-end ones, and you can see some where it was clearly somebody was a craftsman doing it, and clearly they were doing stuff they didn't necessarily have to, when you have these overshot flakes going obliquely and alternating, and they really did that stuff, and that was somebody who had been making it for a long time and knew exactly what they did, and so those kind of things are beyond function, and they're more into achieving an ideal, so they're both of them working together. Yeah, they needed a thin haft. They didn't really have to have it that fabulous, but they did. So, yeah. Anybody else got any other questions? Well, very good.
Steve, that
yeah.
was wonderful, man.
All right, thank you. Thank you.